Okay, so I think we have 21 participants. I don't know if the people can see me. Otherwise, it's not important. You know my face, but if as long as you can hear me, and Dr. Lily Johnson Ulrich is the host here, so she has the control of the presentation here. So, okay, so I think I'm going to start now. Hi, everybody, thanks for being here. And we appreciate you are taking the time to attend the seminar in this final week of classes. And we are recording the seminar for those who can be here, so there will be an opportunity, no? If you can tell to people that were not able to make it. And I remind the faculty that there will be a meeting with Dr. Lily Johnson Ulrich right after the seminar. And then that's from 11 to 12. And then she will have a meeting with the students and postdocs at noon. So there will be nice opportunities to talk with her about the research and a lot of things. Also, Dawn will send a survey for feedback. So it will be greatly appreciated if you can complete it. And let me see. I think it said me, no? Everybody has mute the microphones, but this is a reminder in case that you unmute. So please have your microphones mute because we don't want noise when Dr. Johnson Ulrich is presented. So it is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Lily Johnson Ulrich. She's one of the finalists for the ECCB ACES Fellow position. Dr. Johnson Ulrich graduated from the University of Miami in 2011 with a summa cum laude in psychology and studio art, so that's a dual major, and a minor in biology. And then in 2020, she obtained her PhD from Michigan State University in zoology and ecology, evolutionary biology, and behavior. So it's like a dual degree also, under the mentorship of Dr. Kay Hollekamp. And her dissertation topic was on intraspecific variation in behavioral flexibility of spotted hyenas. Now, currently, she is a postdoctoral researcher at University of Zurich, and she's working on meerkat communication and collective movement. And she's under the mentoring of Doctors Marta Manser and Ariana Stramburg-Peshkin. And she will be telling us about her exciting research in her seminar. So Dr. Lily Johnson Ulrich has 9 peer-reviewed publications, 7 of which as first author, including a book, chapter, and articles in a variety of important journals, such as Biodiversity and Conservation, Scientific Reports, Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, Animal Cognition, among others. So Dr. Lily Johnson Ulrich is in Switzerland now, so it is a 7-hour difference. So for her, it's 5 p.m. already. So we want to start as soon as possible. So the title of the seminar is Urbanization and its Effects on Animal Behavior, Morphology, and Cognition. And without any further delay, please welcome Dr. Lily Johnson Ulrich.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Hurtado. Can everyone hear me all right? Perfect.
Yes.
So I guess I'll start by saying that I had the opportunity to study urban hyenas during my PhD research. And urbanization is a topic that I find myself coming back to both when I'm writing grants or just chatting with other scientists and preparing talks. And ultimately, I think I keep coming back to it because it's an exciting and unique context for asking a wide variety of ecological questions. And it's where the focus of my future research interests lie. So to just jump right in, urbanization is a global phenomenon and it's increasing dramatically. This figure, for example, just shows the percent increase of major urban centers across the world. With the size and the color of this shading showing the size of the urban area and the percentage of increase. And this is from 1990 to 2018 here. And urbanization is perhaps one of the most extreme forms of anthropogenic change because the extent of habitat alteration and destruction. And this figure on the right, for example, shows Paris and the amount of habitat loss over the last 200 years. So the coloration here in this figure shows the time span or the number of years ago in which this habitat loss occurred. So in dark red is habitat loss from about 200 years ago up to these pale orange colors shows habitat that's been lost quite recently. And under urbanization like this, most species become extinct because their habitat simply cease to exist. But some species such as squirrels, great tits, pigeons, peregrine falcons, cockatoos, and even large carnivores like bears all appear to successfully adapt to urbanization. And some might even say that some of these species thrive in urban environments. And I'm really interested in understanding how these urban adapters manage to persist even under such high levels of urbanization. An increasing research suggests that cognitive flexibility might be one of the key ways in which animals are able to adapt to urbanization. So this figure on the left here shows relative brain size in urban adapters and non-urban adapters. This is a study from 2011, and we've got the box plot for brain sizes for the urban adapters. I believe this was a phylogenetic study in birds here in this pink box plot, and the blue box plot shows the relative brain size for non-urban adapters. And we can see that the urban adapters have relatively larger brain size than the non-urban ones. And correspondingly, species that are better at innovative problem solving, meaning species that are better at solving novel problems, are also more likely to invade novel habitats, including urban ones. This was another phylogenetic study in birds. So these are the contrasts that show for each increase in innovation frequency, there's a corresponding increase in the invasion potential of these species. And taken together, I think these results suggest that urbanization is potentially creating cognitive challenges for animals. And I think this is an appealing hypothesis to many scientists because urban environments are highly evolutionary novel and potentially are creating a lot of novel challenges. So the idea that cognitive flexibility and the ability to solve novel problems might help animals adapt seems to make sense under this framework. So if animals with better cognitive abilities that are potentially helping them to flexibly change their behavior are more likely to survive in urban environments, then what, when, and where are these cognitive challenges in particular? And researchers have speculated that animals have to learn a lot of new things, such as learning where to find food. And for many animals, that food source comes from human waste. And another challenge is finding shelter if natural places to hide or den are gone. And third, things like anthropogenic noise can make attracting mates a novel challenge. And all of these challenges are thought to be particularly strong when animals are first experiencing urbanization. So during this transition period to an urban environment is when animals have to learn these things for the very first time, before there's been any time for either evolutionary processes to occur or for any kind of plastic behaviors to have become canalized. And this when hypothesis is something that I looked at during my PhD. So I used an intraspecific comparison to test the idea that when urban environments are challenging is during this initial transition to urbanization. And to test this hypothesis, I compared problem solving in 3 different populations of hyenas. So this population on the far left is a population that I refer to as the Sirena population. And it's a group of hyenas, or several groups of hyenas, that all live near the center of a national reserve. And so they're quite far away from the boundaries of the reserve. And in this part of the park, tourism and other forms of anthropogenic disturbance are highly regulated. So poaching, cattle grazing, and also tourism are all kept to very, very low levels. This is a very pristine habitat for spotted hyenas. And then the second population that we looked at was one that I refer to as Talek because it's a population where the group's home ranges actually overlap this growing Maasai town called Talek Town. And just over the last decade, this town has seen massive population growth. And corresponding with that population growth, there's been a huge uptick in the amount of tourism in the area and also the amount of cattle grazing both inside and outside the park, and also in the amount of poaching. and conflict with hyenas and other large carnivores. So this is a population that's really just starting to experience higher levels of urbanization, and in the very recent past for these hyenas. So in a time span that's too short, shorter than enough time that we would expect to see for any kind of evolutionary change to occur. And then the third population of hyenas that I studied was in the city of Mekelle, Ethiopia. And these hyenas appear to be fully urbanized. They den in churchyards just outside of the cities, and then they commute into the city every night, in and around the city, and in and around the waste dumps, to forage on livestock remains and trash. And as far as we can tell, these hyenas have been coexisting alongside people in Ethiopia for at least 100 years. So this population represents a fairly stable, long-term urbanized population. And if this transition period to urbanization is the period that's the most cognitively challenging or most demanding for animals, then I predicted that the Talic hyenas would show the highest levels of problem-solving ability compared to either the Serena or the Mekelle hyenas. And I focused on innovative problem solving for this study using a multi-axis puzzle box. So this is a huge metal box that's baited with meat on the inside, and it has 4 different doors. This hyena here, she's the alpha female of the clan, using the push door, which is one that only depresses inwards to retrieve the meat. And all 4 doors can be used to access the same chamber on the inside. This is a really low-ranking subadult male using the doorknob side. And this is a low-ranking immigrant male, adult male, and he's using the sliding door right here, but it only slides in one direction, so he actually is shoving it in the wrong direction. But he does a pretty good job of correcting himself quite quickly and sliding open in the correct direction. And then the 4th door is this one the hyena is going to use here. So it's the hyena on the left, and she's a young adult female. She was actually mid-ranking at the time of the study, but now she's actually the alpha female of this clan of hyenas, and she's pulling open the drawer. And so I designed this puzzle box for testing innovation with 4 different doors so that I could test hyena's ability to solve a novel problem 4 different times. And each of the 4 doors require a different motor skill. So I really wanted to see if hyenas could express this flexible motor behavior and show 4 different motor behaviors in this flexible manner. Because after hyenas had opened a door multiple times in a row, I would then screw that door shut to see if they were able to then subsequently open a second door. And this project took a huge collaborative effort. I was lucky enough to be awarded additional funding for this research that I used to initiate a collaboration with Dr. Gidi Yurga. And he's a professor at Mekelle University and an expert on the urban spotted hyenas. And my research assistant, Ramad, and we traveled to Ethiopia for 3 months to work with Dr. Gidi in Mekelle. And on the Kenyan side of things, I worked closely with the Mara Hyena Project's senior research assistant, Benson Pion. He's been with the project for over a decade and can recognize over 500 hyenas on site, either from their spots or even from little things like ear damage or the way the hyena is walking. And while I was in camp, I also served as camp manager, where I got the opportunity to mentor other students at the project's field site. So what did we find? Ultimately, so this figure here on the left shows the average innovation score for each of the populations. So out of the 4 different doors, what was the average number of doors opened by hyenas that participated? And again, this Serena population is the non-urban, and then Talic was the transitional, and Mekelle was the fully urban population. And what I found was that the Serena hyenas were on average opening about 1.5 doors, whereas the Talic hyenas were only opening about half a door on average, and the Mekelle hyenas, actually only 1 out of the 15 hyenas tested opened 1 door. So this is the complete opposite to what I predicted, which I actually thought made for a much more exciting result than if it had aligned with our predictions. And I don't think it's too surprising that we got a very different result with hyenas, because this was one of the first studies that was done on urbanization and problem solving outside of birds or small mammals. So it's not too surprising that the way urbanization affects a large carnivore is very different than the way it affects smaller bodied animals. And I think this also challenges one of the ideas that urban environments might be just cognitively demanding across the board or creating all these novel conditions for all species. And instead, we really need to pay close attention to what exactly is each species' niche in an urban environment, and does that actually include any novel challenges that the animal has to overcome. So what is the spotted hyena niche in an urban environment? Well, one of the biggest differences between urban and non-urban hyenas is that the urban hyenas are 100% scavengers. As far as I can tell, they're not hunting any of the livestock at all. I actually, one of the evenings where I was out here testing the hyenas, a donkey had gotten loose and was running down the road and ran right through an area where there's 30 hyenas milling around. And some of the hyenas actually took chase. But when we went down the road, the donkey was doing a perfectly good job fending the hyenas off, and it was actually only the juvenile hyenas that were even trying to take have a go at the donkey, and all the other hyenas had kind of given up and had gone off and were sleeping. And I think that there really is enough in the way of waste and livestock remains that there's really no demand for hunting at all in this urban environment. And instead, the hyenas are able to persist completely just off livestock remains. Whereas hyenas in the Masai Mara, where the Sirena and Talak populations are, these hyenas hunt for 95% of their own food. And in the Talak population, some of that is livestock, but in Sirena, it's 100% wild ungulates. And I suspect that hunting wild ungulates probably requires much more in the way of motor skill than scavenging on remains. And I also found an interesting result that supports this switch from hunting to scavenging hypothesis. This is a project that one of my undergraduate research students did, Dan Messina, and he used photogrammetry techniques. So photogrammetry is basically taking measurements from photos, and we were actually able to use the multi-axis box as our yardstick because we knew what size it was. And so anytime we had a hyena line up perfectly perpendicular to the box, we were able to use one of these photogrammetry programs to take morphological measurements. And we actually found that the lower leg length in these urban hyenas was significantly shorter than the non-urban hyenas. In this figure here, you can see it's almost a 7-centimeter difference between the urban and non-urban hyenas in their lower leg length. And this is an example of an urban hyena that looks pretty squat to me. And so I think this further suggests that reduced demand for hunting and having long legs might also have these impacts on morphology. And hyenas are persistence hunters. So they are mostly hunting by running their prey down to exhaustion. So having long legs is probably quite adaptive if you're a persistence hunter, but if you're just scavenging, there might be reduced selective pressure there. So just to briefly recap where we are, I found that urbanization has a negative effect on problem solving and also a negative effect on limb morphology in urban hyenas. And I suspect that this could be due to a switch from hunting to scavenging. But right now, this is just a hypothesis, and it's something that I'm very interested in testing in future research. But another thing that urbanization changes that I'd like to talk about that can have important repercussions for species is the social structure. And Stroller et al. In 2022 actually just published a paper that found that group size and density of the urban hyenas in Mekelle is actually far higher than any observed across sub-Saharan Africa. And furthermore, they also reported very low levels of aggressive behavior. And when I visited Mekelle, this is a video that I shot, I found a similar thing. Even just at this one field site, where I was testing cognition, identified over 100 unique hyenas by their spot patterns with very low levels of aggression. So this was quite a surprising number of hyenas all coming through the same area. For comparison, I think the average clan size for hyenas is usually just around 20 or 30 hyenas. And we've also observed this trend to a smaller extent in our Talak population. So our Talak population is this group of hyenas whose home range overlaps the boundary of the park and goes into the Maasai town of Talak. And just over the last decade, seemingly in step with the population increase of humans, we've also seen the number and density of hyenas increasing, with some of our clans reaching close to 100 hyenas. And we suspect that this is probably related either to the easier source of food from livestock or reduced competition with other large carnivores, because other large carnivores like lions are actually really avoiding this area. And in hyenas, group size is not just related to behaviors like aggression, cooperation, and intra-group competition. But group size is also related to another cognitive ability that I studied called inhibitory control. And inhibitory control is basically the ability to inhibit doing a specific behavior when it's not adaptive to do so. And it's what you might commonly think of as self-control in humans. In animals, it's often tested using what's called the cylinder test. And in the cylinder test, a piece of food or bait is placed in the middle of the cylinder, and the animal has to inhibit going straight for the food and instead detour to the openings on either side. And this is a fairly small detour, so it sounds pretty simple, but it's actually quite difficult for a lot of animals. And I have a video here that's pretty funny of a couple different species failing quite badly at the cylinder test. And there's training trials that happen before these tests. So it's not just that the animal can't see the cylinder or doesn't know how to get the food. But most of these species also had successful trials. And I'm only showing you the unsuccessful ones, for example, here. And so let's see. And this is an example of a cylinder test trial in a wild hyena. This is a young subadult female. And this is a trial where she fails because she bumps into the outside of the cylinder. And she actually fails twice just in this one trial. I mean, even though it's only coded as one fail, because she bumps into the wall of the cylinder on one side, she actually completely misses the opening and bumps into the cylinder on the other side. So it can be challenging to go for the food from the way that's not actually what looks like the closest point to the food. But this subadult female, she also had a few successful trials as well. And this is what a successful trial looked like. You can actually see that she glances through the wall of the cylinder, but inhibits trying to bite the food directly and actually is able to then detour and get the food from the side. So that's an example of having good inhibitory control there. And I found that the probability of having a successful trial with this cylinder test was significantly correlated with both group size and the size of the cohort that cubs grew up in. So this figure here shows the predicted probabilities of passing a trial on the y-axis here. And then we have clan size on the x-axis on the left figure and cohort size on the x-axis in this figure on the right. And in both cases, we see this positive association. And I think that the link between cohort size and the probability of passing a trial is interesting because it suggests that this is a skill that is really important during the developmental period, and that hyenas are probably developing this skill while they're cubs. And I thought this result is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, it means that urbanization could be having indirect effects on abilities like inhibitory control. If urbanization is affecting group size, and then group size is affecting these kind of abilities like inhibitory control, which then could then have further downstream consequences for other behaviors. And the other reason I thought this result was really interesting is because why should something like group size affect how hyenas do on a physical test of inhibitory control? And inhibition is thought to be really adaptive in social animals, because animals in these kind of complex social groups often have to inhibit certain behaviors. Like for hyenas, this low-ranking hyena pictured here has to inhibit feeding on this carcass while high-ranking hyenas are present or risk getting aggressed upon. So this ability to inhibit feeding when a social barrier is present is probably quite adaptive. But I thought it was surprising that inhibition in a social barrier might translate to inhibition when there's a physical barrier, because psychological literature suggests that the cognitive abilities developed in a social domain might not necessarily translate to the physical domain. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the urban groups of hyenas that have these largest clan sizes. So these two clans on the right are both the urbanized one, and the one on the far right is our most heavily urbanized clan of hyenas. And I also wonder if urbanization might not be having direct as well as indirect effects on inhibitory control. the Maasai herders do spear hyenas when they encounter them. And we've also had several mass poisoning events where the herders leave out a poisoned carcass. And this not only takes out hyenas, but also jackals, vultures, and tawny eagles. And this makes me wonder if urbanization might also have a direct effect on abilities like inhibitory control by a sensitization towards humans and not just through group size. So in other words, does human disturbance cause hyenas to be more inhibited towards human objects like the cylinder test? And previous hyena research found that human disturbance has a negative effect on boldness. So this was a study that was done on cubs in high and low disturbance areas. So this high disturbance area is actually the Talek population, and the low is the Serena population that was living in the really pristine part of the park. And what they found, they scored cubs on their boldness for 0 if they didn't interact with the novel object, and 3 if they showed multiple exploratory behaviors. And what they found is that the proportion of subjects that got this top boldness score was much, much lower in the high disturbance area. And in the low disturbance area, the cubs were much more bold. So I think this suggests that human disturbance could be having this negative effect on how willing hyenas are to interact with human apparatus. Because I think it's important to keep in mind that every time we're testing an animal's abilities and we're using something like a novel object trial or some kind of cognitive apparatus, that this is also a human apparatus that is being presented to them. And this topic of how an animal's relationship with humans can affect the way that they perform on a task is also something that I've looked at during my postdoc research with meerkats. And this was a project where we compared exploration behavior towards novel human objects in both fully habituated and partially habituated meerkats. So fully habituated meerkats were those that had been raised, grew up with human researchers present from when they were pups. Whereas partly habituated meerkats only started encountering humans as adults. And this has a really big effect on their habituation level. Meerkats that see humans from when they're pups pretty much ignore humans like they're part of the background. Whereas meerkats that only start to be habituated to humans as adults really take a long time to accept their presence. And we looked at 2 different behaviors. So we looked at whether or not meerkats actually approach this grid of novel objects. So in this image here in the center, this black circle is around the burrow entrance, and then there's a grid with multiple little novel objects in it. And we looked at whether or not meerkats approach this grid, which is the results for that are shown on the left, and also whether or not they actually interacted and manipulated these objects. And we found this really interesting interaction between in the partly habituated meerkats based on whether a human was present during testing or whether the trial was just filmed with a video camera and no human was present. And when a human was present, the partly habituated meerkats were actually more likely to approach the grid. But if we look over on the right here, they're far less likely to actually manipulate and interact with objects. And we think this is because the partly habituated meerkats have started to associate humans with provisioning food, which is provided when daily weights are taken, but aren't really accustomed to the human presence and might still perceive the human with some risk. So that when the human is present, they're willing to go and take a look at the experimental grid, but they're not willing to actually interact with the novel objects. And I think this suggests that animals are really closely weighing the risk-reward trade-offs based on their prior experience with humans. And that these risk-reward trade-offs may manifest in fairly subtle ways that we might not expect. So just to pause again and recap here, we've seen how urbanization affects problem solving and social structure, and how things like social structure or habituation can further affect cognitive and behavioral traits. And I've suggested a few hypotheses for how these things all might be interlinked. And one final aspect of urbanization that I think is quite important for species traits is the altered spatial structure of urban environments. And urbanization changes the spatial structure of landscapes quite dramatically, with things like roads, dams, bridges, and fences all creating significant barriers for animals. And we know these barriers can have negative repercussions because mitigating road barriers using things like overpasses or tunnels can dramatically improve species outcomes. And I'm really interested in how this spatial structure might be changing animal movement patterns and the spatial cognition of animals living there, and how traits like inhibitory control might help animals to deal with barriers. And I bring up inhibitory control again here because inhibitory control is in essence a miniature spatial test. People used to test, and actually still do test, inhibitory control using a larger scale detour test, such as this V-shaped fence here. So in the classic spatial detour test, a piece of food or reward will be placed on the other side of the fence, and the animal, in this case a dog, would have to actually walk further away from the treat before they can make it around the fence to go get it. And just like with the cylinder test, it can be quite hard to inhibit going straight for the food and then actually walk away from the food in order to retrieve it. And the cylinder test was designed basically as a miniature version of this fence test, where the animal just has to make one very small detour around to the openings to the side to retrieve the food. And urbanization creates these new spatial barriers that animals have to detour around, and I'm really curious if inhibitory control can help animals navigate detours. This is a kind of fun video where we have a hyena here, and she's having a really hard time inhibiting going straight over this bridge. This is a concrete bridge right here. And the quickest way to reach the cylinder, which she's already associated with food, is to kind of come straight over the bridge and walk towards it. But it's too high for her to jump up over. And she tries quite a few times to just jump straight up over the bridge, but fails to inhibit taking that direct path. And she eventually takes a path that's a little bit over to the left, where she can jump up and makes it over to the cylinder. But I thought this was really interesting because in a way in this video, we don't have just one test of inhibitory control, but actually two. Because first the hyena has to inhibit the bridge as a barrier and has to detour around the bridge. And then second, the cylinder test also tests her inhibitory control. And I'm really interested in further understanding if spatial challenges, in addition to things like group size and habituation, affect cognitive traits and the way we measure and the way animals express these traits, and ultimately affect the movement patterns and space use of animals in urban environments. And these are some interests that I've developed during my postdoc research. My postdocs focused on meerkat movement ecology, and I've been involved in several different projects as part of it. So the first project I'm involved in is looking at collective movement decisions. So this figure on the left here, each little dot actually represents the movement of a meerkat every second. And this video is spread up a little bit, but we can see all the different group members as they're moving along together. And to collect this data, we actually put GPS collars on every single adult meerkat in the group, so that we can see how each individual meerkat's movement and also their vocalizations with audio tags that are built in affect the movement of every other meerkat in the group. And this project's been part of a collaboration with researchers from the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Germany. And we've also heavily involved my master's student, Masia, who's from the University of the Free State in South Africa. And he's been working on comparing movement and spatial positioning to the foraging success of meerkats. And this is all ongoing research, so please stay tuned, and hopefully some results will be coming out later this year. And I've also been working on developing the use of long-term GPS collars to look at large-scale movements across the entire home range. These data points show the movement points of a meerkat every 15 minutes over the course of, I think it was about 3 weeks or so, before the battery died. And battery size is really the main limitation with collecting long-term data on the meerkats because their body size is so small. And one of the things that we've been trial running is using solar panel GPS collars. So in these collars, the GPS tag is in this little hexagonal shaped casing. And there's actually 3 solar panels placed on the outside of the tag, and then a rechargeable battery that goes beneath the meerkat's neck. And I think meerkats' movement ecology is really interesting because they actually use this massive network of thousands of bolt holes that are spread out across the entire home range. And they appear to memorize the location of every bolt hole perfectly, because if there's an alarm call, if there's a marshal eagle flying over, the meerkats all just run immediately straight for the closest bolt hole, even if that bolt hole is 20 meters away and completely out of sight in some little bush that I would have had no idea that it was there. And I'm really hoping that these long-term collars can reveal some movement patterns that might align with this bolt hole network, and maybe reveal exactly how meerkats remember where these bolt holes are and how they navigate their home ranges. And third, I've also been conducting translocation experiments with the meerkats. So in these, we capture a meerkat and move roughly 1.5 kilometers away from the group to an area on the boundary of the meerkat's home range, where we release it, and then release it with a GPS collar to record its track back to the group. So in this example, this was a meerkat named Barney. And what I think is really cool about this is when I overlaid his track with Google satellite imagery, you can actually see where the open flats are. Actually, all these kind of bluish areas are the open flats. And then all these reddish areas are the sand dunes. And each little black dot here is a tree or a group of bushes. And what's interesting about this track is that Barney seems to be entirely avoiding these open flats and makes quite a big detour from what would be the most direct route home in order to stay in these really vegetated areas. And he also seemed to be going from bolt hole to bolt hole along this route. What's also kind of interesting is that he made a second detour back to the meerkat sleeping burrow, which is this second U shape over here, if you guys can see my mouse. And he's rested at the sleeping burrow for a little bit before going back to the group. And he completely bypassed the spot where we captured him, and instead just went straight over to where the group was. And this was also a fun example too, because he actually spent about an hour where we released him making a lot of little test runs before he finally went on the final push back to rejoin his group. So it looked like he was making a lot of little runs potentially to maybe gain information about where he was before setting off to rejoin the group. And I think these experiments can reveal stuff like what habitat features are affecting the route traveled back to the group, and whether this includes things like bolt holes, dunes, and vegetation, which hopefully can also reveal information about what meerkats remember about their home ranges. And finally, my master's student, Thomas, has been comparing spatial learning to inhibitory control. He's actually holding a little meerkat-sized cylinder test, although it's more like a box in this case. And he's comparing that to how well meerkats do on this spatial learning test. And this is a cross maze here that I designed based on the mazes that psychologists use with captive rodents. And hopefully this will allow us to get good information on their spatial learning abilities out in the field. And the meerkats are actually pretty easy to test with something like the cross maze here. And I think they like these tubes because they're really similar in size to the bolt holes that they naturally use. And the meerkats are pretty good at very quickly learning to find the correct arm to exit. So only one of these arms was actually unlocked. And I think the unique spatial challenges created by urbanization create a really exciting avenue for ongoing research in urban wildlife, particularly with large carnivores like hyenas. The urban hyenas have a kind of unique system because they must commute from these critical denning habitats in churchyards, which pretty much represent the only vegetation in the area. And then they commute every night to the city to forage on trash and livestock remains. And you can see the edge of the city just here on the horizon of this photo. And you can see all of the land in between is completely deforested. This is all cropland and grazing land. And on these commutes, they have to navigate roads, fences, buildings, and drainage ditches. And I'm really interested in how the urban spatial structure affects these hyena movement patterns, both at the individual and at the collective level. And do abilities like learning or inhibition also help hyenas to handle these new spatial challenges? So I've told you a little bit about both my past research and how this feeds into my ongoing research interests. And I think understanding the mechanism by which urbanization alters species traits is important because a great deal of research continues to identify more and more traits that are changing in animals under urbanization. The ones listed here on the right are just the ones that we've observed or documented in hyenas. And not only do we have very little understanding of how or why these traits change, but we also have very little understanding of what the long-term outcomes of altered traits are for individuals and populations. And investigating the long-term consequences of these altered traits, I think, is also important because urban habitats can very easily become ecological traps. This was a study done in black bears here. And this left figure shows their annual reproductive success by age on the x-axis. And the urban bears are represented by these black triangles and the non-urban bears by these white diamonds. And what we see is that the urban bears have much higher reproductive success, especially for older bears, than the ones in wildland habitats. But if we look at the figure on the right, here this shows the survival rates of bears based on age. And what we see is that these urban bears, again in the black triangles, they have very, very high mortality. We have this huge drop in numbers within the first year of life. And what the researchers actually found is that the bear population was not sustaining itself. This drop in survival of cubs in the urban habitat actually meant that the overall lifetime fitness was much lower compared to the wildland bears, and that this urban population was really only maintaining itself by immigration from bears moving into the habitat. So the urban areas were really creating these ecological sinks. And I observed totally independently from urbanization, I observed a similar pattern between innovative problem solving and fitness in hyenas. So here, this figure on the left shows innovative females in gold and non-innovative females in black. And on the y-axis, we have the annual cub production. And what we see is that for innovative females, they produce slightly more, but significantly more cubs per year on average than the non-innovative females. But if we look at the survival curve over here on the right, where we have the percent of cubs surviving from birth across time, just like with the bears, we see a similar drop very early in life where survival is actually much lower for the cubs of innovative females. And ultimately, it seemed like the reproductive success of innovative and non-innovative females was quite similar over the long term. So even in non-urban populations, there's not a clear relationship between cognitive skills like problem solving and fitness outcomes. And we really have no idea what these survival curves or reproductive success rates might be for urban animals. And without this information, it would be really hard to make predictions about long-term persistence or future responses to increasing urbanization. So just to summarize here, I'm really interested in under-urbanization. What traits change, why are they changing, and what are the long-term consequences of these changes? And I think this topic is important and exciting in two different ways. First, urbanization creates this natural experiment for studying both evolutionary processes and plastic processes in action. And second, with urbanization increasing globally, I think understanding how wildlife can adapt and persist alongside humans is becoming of ever increasing importance. And I think spotted hyenas are an ideal organism to investigate the causes and consequences of altered traits under urbanization. First, because we have a lot less research on large carnivores and urbanization, but large carnivores frequently occupy key positions in food webs, and they're also a lot more likely to come into conflict with humans. And hyenas seem to be uniquely adaptable, which makes them especially interesting from both this ecological and conservation viewpoint. And I think my research in hyenas also creates a really nice springboard for doing more comparative work across carnivora. There's already researchers in the US studying the cognition of urban coyotes and urban raccoons, and I think it'd be really exciting to compare the effects of urbanization across multiple cities and across multiple species in both the US and East Africa. And with Dr. Kay Holekamp's retirement, myself and 4 other early career researchers have been trusted with continuing the Mara Hyena project. This is a long-term project that's been going on for over 30 years. And we currently manage several aspects of the project and serve as directors on the board of its nonprofit. And separately, I've already forged a collaboration with Dr. Giddy in Ethiopia, and I am to begin an urban hyena project to study the urban hyenas in multiple cities in Ethiopia and also cities in Kenya, such as Nairobi. And I think these projects create really unique student research opportunities. We currently use NSF IRIS grants to offer paid one-year internships to American students to conduct research in Kenya alongside Maasai research students. And not only is this fantastic hands-on experience for students with large carnivores, but by paying research assistants, I think we can really facilitate the involvement of students from diverse backgrounds to gain crucial field experience. And we're lucky that NSF IRIS and other grants support this. And second, I'm really committed to decolonializing the project long-term. And by decolonializing, what I mean is that we don't just want research to be Westerners showing up in a foreign country, collecting data and leaving with our publications. Instead, we aim to not just hire and collaborate with local researchers, but also contribute to capacity building in Kenya through research internships available to Kenyan students and providing short courses on things like data collection methods or statistical methods. And finally, I've been working hard to try and facilitate more Maasai women's representation in STEM. Maasai culture tends to be patriarchal, and it's really only the last 2 years that female guides have started working in the Maasai Mara. And we hope to bring in Maasai women both as students and as researchers. And long-term, I foresee the Hyena project being run by Kenyan PIs with foreign PIs included as collaborators rather than as the main principal investigators on these projects. And the Mara Hyena project also provides really great opportunities for student learning. I've taught 2 field courses in Kenya and assisted on field courses in the Kalahari, South Africa, both focused on ecology. And I found that field courses are fantastic for student learning because it gives students not just hands-on learning opportunities, but the chance to collect data and test hypotheses and make conclusions for themselves in the ecosystems that they're learning about. And I hope to continue offering summer field courses throughout my career, where I find it's really fun to collaborate with students as scientists, where together we get to investigate interesting ecological questions. And I think study abroad programs can also benefit diversity initiatives when we include local students alongside study abroad students. And here students get to learn side by side with Kenyan or South African students, which I found really deepens the discussions that students are having about the culture surrounding wildlife and ecology, and also improves the quality of the research questions that students are asking, because the local students bring in a really different knowledge background and knowledge base than the American students. And away from the field, I also strive to make my classroom and office a safe, inclusive space. And this doesn't just mean being respectful to one another, but it also means decolonializing the way we present the history of science. For example, Project Biodiversity is a great resource that I've been involved in. And it involves sharing the research and stories of minority researchers. So right now, this is an online repository with slides that can be used in introductory biology and ecology classes. And I think it's really important to augment the standard curriculum of white historical European men with examples of all the really important research that was done historically by minorities, and also research that's being done today by people from all backgrounds. And both in the field and in the classroom, I try to teach in a way that can benefit all students by facilitating engagement with new information and dialogue as an integral part of the learning process, in addition to facilitating broader engagement with tools like Project Biodiversify. And maintaining a certain level of flexibility, I found, is really appreciated by students and can also be harnessed into learning opportunities. Like one simple example might be allowing students to correct mistakes on quizzes as long as they include a detailed explanation of why that answer was wrong in order to earn back partial credit. Something like this helps a student to come back and re-engage with the material. And this kind of flexibility can also help students feel like they have more control over their own learning process. And if hired as faculty, my students could start working on several projects right away using data that I've already collected. So one student project that I'm really excited to get off the ground is one looking at some of the data that I collected during my PhD and then comparing it to I think it's 7 years now of data that we have on hyena behavior, relatedness, and demography. So how does problem solving, inhibition, and urbanization correlate with behavioral outcomes like aggression, hunting success, and ultimately fitness consequences. And then another 2 student projects could involve meerkat data with the data that I've been working on collecting on long-term movement, and also meerkat spatial learning and inhibitory control. And I also aim to renew our IRIS grant, which is an NSF grant for student projects. And this could fund both student research assistantships and also summer field seasons in Kenya for students. And one summer field project that a new student could start working on right away that wouldn't involve too much funding would be looking at the relationship between habituation or sensitization and problem solving, to look at how animals' relationships with humans might affect the other behaviors that we're measuring. And I also aim to put in large grant applications for bigger projects, such as comparative work on urban carnivore problem solving, funding to buy GPS collars to look at urban hyena spatial ecology, and also projects on urbanization and domestication with hyenas in multiple urban field sites across East Africa. So with that, I'd like to give a big thanks to all of my collaborators and my funders. And of course, many thanks to all of you here on Zoom for being here and listening to me today.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Johnson Ulrich. I think you finished, no? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, so we have like in this hour still we have 8 minutes for questions, and I remind the faculty that then after this we have an hour meeting with faculty, so you can ask questions to Dr. Ulrich on different aspects of her research, teaching, and diversity. And also later at noon we have the meeting with the students and postdocs. So remember to send us the feedback once done, send the survey, no, about all the interactions that you have with Dr. Johnson Ulrich. And I have to leave because I have an exam in my class, yeah? But if you want to ask questions, so go ahead, and I think you are the host, and good luck. Thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Asko Normits. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Given that you come to this with a psychology degree,
Yes.
are there any lessons we can take for interpreting human behavior?
Oh, for interpreting human behavior. Yeah, let me think about this one. So most of my experience with psychology, I mean, the main reason I got the psychology degree as an undergraduate was because all of the behavioral and cognitive courses were in the psych department. So I ended up with the credits for a psychology degree. And I found it quite useful to integrate all of the ways that they test laboratory rodent cognition and try to adapt these for the field. But I haven't really thought about it as much from the other direction. And I'm glad that you bring that up, because that actually is a very interesting question. And I don't know if I have a good answer for you right now, but I'm going to write this one down and think about it. If I can think of those specific lessons that we can bring to what we would say about human behavior.
Okay, I was worried whether I should move from city to countryside to regain some creativity.
Well, at least for some animals, like birds especially, they seem to be more creative or more behaviorally flexible in the urban habitats. But I also wonder too, birds are also quite used to interacting with human apparatus to get food from bird feeders. And not to say that any of the bird comparative research on urbanization is inaccurate, but I think my main conclusion from studying the animals is that if you had to choose between, is it necessity drives innovation, or does spare time drive innovation and creativity? My main thing would be, I don't think it's necessity. I think that animals with the time that have the free time and that also are quite habituated or used to interacting with things in a flexible way, that those are the ones that are the most innovative.
What about fear?
Say again?
What about fear?
Yeah, and I think that then plays a role too, because for the urban hyenas, I think it is that case that stress and fearfulness towards humans is suppressing their ability to express this kind of flexible, creative problem solving. And they, despite living in among the humans and in the city, I found the urban hyenas to be fairly skittish. They weren't happy with having vehicles around. When we were testing them, we had to turn off the car, cover up any possible lights in the car, put our infrared spotlights on the hyenas and maintain perfect silence. So they're well adapted to living alongside humans, but they're mostly nocturnal and trying to avoid what's going on. And I think that's something that's also underrepresented. Everybody's focusing on, oh, what's the cognition adapted for? But I think it's quite true that things like stress and fearfulness can then also have these effects that have nothing to do with have effects on their cognition that have nothing to do with like the adaptive function of the cognitive ability.
Yes, I wondered about that fear aspect as well. You
Yeah.
focused on the challenges largely of obtaining resources in the urban environment.
Yeah.
But you know, when I've been in African cities, there's usually a lot of street dogs, a lot of dogs wandering around the city. Don't the dogs harass the wildlife when they come into contact? Or
you know, I saw dogs and hyenas foraging on the same trash heap, like in total coexistence, which was the most wild thing. But I think you're spot on about the fear, and I mean, that's the reason I think one of the first student projects that I really want to investigate is, okay, let's see if we can measure each at the individual level, how are hyenas reacting to the human presence. And we can't exactly do flight initiation tests with the wild hyenas. But I think actually there is a researcher who has done, so a flight initiation test, meaning you walk towards an animal until it flies away. So it was designed in birds. And I think doing some kind of test like this with the urban hyenas and the wild hyenas, maybe with like a vehicle movement initiation test, or potentially some kind of startle response trials, to get an individual level, okay, how are these hyenas reacting to humans? And then compare that to how well they do on these behavioral tests and how that affects other behaviors that we can measure.
interesting. Could you imagine initiating research along these lines here locally in Texas? I mean, we have a lot of urban wildlife.
Yes, college campuses are perfect. So yeah, I think it's exactly what one of the things I would love to do is establish a local field site. And I think that, yeah, college campuses are great places to look at urban animals, especially urban small carnivores like raccoons or foxes or skunks. And I think that's the kind of thing that's perfect for undergraduate or master's research projects if they really want to take a look at the local wildlife. And it would be really fun, I think, to put up some camera traps and figure out where these animals are and then see if we can't leave out some tests for them.
Okay, we might have time for one more question.
I have a question about traits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting research. So thank you for sharing that with us. I was really surprised and interested in the 7-centimeter difference in hind limb length.
Yeah.
No, so is that relative length?
Yeah.
Or is that like absolute length?
I think it was the 7 centimeters was the difference on average. So the pooled difference between the average length of the leg in the urban hyenas compared to the average leg length in the non-urban ones.
So could it just be a size shift?
Yeah, and actually the shoulder height overall was actually also different, but it wasn't reliable. When I was testing how reliable is the photogrammetry, so we have darting data from hyenas that were darted and captured in the Talc population and in the Serena populations. So I sort of verified this technique by comparing, okay, if puzzle box trial with this hyena, we measured this leg length or this shoulder height or this length of the head. And then I compared that to the actual data that we had on our actual leg lengths measured on the hyena while it was sedated. And that one didn't quite come out as reliable, so I didn't include it, but their overall shoulder height, I suspect, is also lower. And I'm desperate to go put out camera traps where I can either put out an actual yardstick or there's some techniques where you can put 2 camera traps up just at like right next to each other, and then you can get 3D information from these photogrammetry things. And I think it would be like a fantastic non-invasive way to get, you know, okay, not just their leg length, which is the only thing that was reliable, I think, just because the leg is the easiest thing to measure, but get whole body morphological measurements on them.
Mhm. Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like now it's time for Dr. Johnson Ulrich's meeting with the faculty. So I hope all of you folks can stay on the Zoom. I guess, Lily, you're still the host of the session.
Cool.
And then the students and others can hop off, but then hopefully the students, y'all come back in another hour, I believe is the schedule.
Cool.